We are live. We've only got him for about 25 minutes. He's going to join us for a full hour from Cancun next week, where they're having this UN meeting, just as important as the Copenhagen event that was blown to bits politically by the leaking of the emails from East Anglia. Now a cascade of frauds has come out since then. He's only joining us for 25 minutes because he's been delayed. He is the deputy leader of the UK Independence Party, Lord Christopher Monckton. He's got to go to one of their events, so he's got to leave us early because of the tube strikes that hit London, with around 70% of the stations closed around the network. But he joins us to briefly, in hindsight, recap what happened last year, what's happened since then, and how important this new meeting is for the global neo-feudalistic socialist takeover of all infrastructure is that we face. And then I want to talk to Lord Monckton after he gives us a quick briefing on this, about the special climate change program to be discussed in Mexico, executive summary. It actually states forced relocation of populations basically into work zones. So this is off the charts. Meanwhile, the Telegraph reports today, Cancun Climate Change Summit, scientists call for rationing in developed world. So this is real concentration camp type control. We've had a lot of their top leaders openly say that they are green Nazis in their own words, that they want authoritarianism. You cannot overstate how wicked they are. Lord Christopher Monckton of Science and publicpolicy.org is the third Viscount of Monckton and Brenchley, and he really needs no introduction here. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Well, Alex, as always, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And yes, you've just given a very good summary of some of the things that the usual suspects are trying to cook up at Cancun. And you will have seen over the last few weeks a certain amount of propaganda about how nobody expects very much of a result, etc., etc. They're talking it down, whereas they talked up Copenhagen. Well, they talked up Copenhagen, which was the climate conference this time last year, again intended to establish a world government treaty. That one failed utterly. So now they're trying to pretend that nothing very much is going to happen, when in fact they've been very quietly over the last year drafting an extremely detailed treaty under the supervision of the German government. There have been several meetings in Bonn, and so now they're ready to put that treaty to the leaders of the world and try to persuade them that they should back this treaty and go along with it. So Cancun could yet be the moment at which world government finally comes into place. And you're quite right. In parallel with that official activity, there are so-called groups of scientists, and of course they're not in fact scientists. These are Marxists from the political extreme left who pretend that they are scientists. And what they are trying to do is to raise the profile of the Cancun talks by suggesting all sorts of lunatic measures like forced resettlement of populations, concentration camps almost, as you rightly said. This is the kind of thing some of them have been talking about. And the latest notion, which appeared in the Telegraph today, food rationing in the West. And of course, these are all measures which socialists and communists will be well familiar with, but which people who live under free markets tend not to go along with. And there's no doubt that this scene setting is a deliberate attempt, first of all, to raise the profile of the Cancun talks, but also by stating things far more extreme than Cancun will actually get round to doing, to try and make whatever comes out of Cancun seem reasonable, so that we almost breathe a sigh of relief when the world government takes over. So it's a very careful piece of news management. But underlying all this, there is no basis in science for spending a single cent on trying to make global warming go away. Absolutely no basis for it. There has been a continuing and now rapidly increasing stream of papers in the scientific peer-reviewed literature. You will probably not have seen a single one of them reported in any of the mainstream news media, making it quite plain that there is no longer any basis for alarm about the climate. And I recently went to the World Federation of Scientists annual seminar on planetary emergencies held at Erice, a wonderful medieval monastic village in Sicily. And there were 250 of some of the world's most eminent scientists, including several climatologists. And there were 5 of us who did presentations saying the climate wasn't going to be a problem, and each producing scientific research to show that, and only 2 who said the opposite. And the 2 who said the opposite didn't have any original scientific research to show. They merely parroted the results of the UN's climate panel, the IPCC, trying to claim that you will get very large amounts of warming, but in fact, you won't. I talked to Professor Richard Lindzen of MIT, who knows more about the atmosphere than anybody else alive, and I said to him, Richard, it's a very interesting conference, this, because here we've got a supposed, so-called consensus, which is actually against the consensus we're told exists in the outside world. I said, what's going on here? He said, it's very simple. Only a few dozen scientists and researchers worldwide have ever worked on the question, how much global warming will we get if we add CO2 to the atmosphere? All the rest are simply taking the figures they're given by the few who have worked it out, and they said if it's this figure, then it's all going to be terrible.
Well, Lord Monckton, I mean, if I can interrupt for a moment, specifically, though, you are of the great field of people out there resisting this fraud and this tyranny, the most prominent, the most accurate, reading science and publicpolicy.org years ago, interviewing you extensively last year, where you laid out all of their specific frauds, their specific reports. They put out reports in mainline newspapers calling for your arrest. You called the glaciation issues in the Himalayas with precision that it was just a fraud made up. You called I mean, from A to Z, exactly what their fraud was. And now in the last year, we had the 1-year anniversary of the kickoff of ClimateGate just last week. It has all come out, but they've spun it with Pachauri in the New York Times saying, we're sorry, we got it wrong, it was a mistake. But we know it wasn't a mistake. It is a hoax of hoaxes for them to beat this drum that no scientist disagrees. There is a total consensus when we know the consensus is on the other side saying it's a fraud. So it would seem that they would have to be dead in the water, but they're not. California has passed the carbon tax. The city of Austin has passed it. Areas of Europe are engaging in it. Can you go over some of the frauds that have taken place and where you see this group of tyrants in their attempt to seize the global economy and set up their world government? I mean, who's winning the ball game?
There's no doubt on the science, the tyrants have lost. That's why I say this key central point, which I will just finish because it's a very important one, is that of those who, this tiny few dozen who have worked on the question how much warming we get, the ones that do it by playing with Xbox 360s and PlayStations, and they do it on the, on sort of computer games, computer models, they are the ones that say we've got a problem, but they're not dealing with the real world. All the ones who do it as I do, by measurement and observation, and then thinking about what we've measured and observed, we are saying, no, there isn't a problem. Yes, you'll get some warming, but it simply won't be enough to worry about. And so far, it is we who are being proved right. The main fraud, which they still try to get away with, is that temperatures are rising at a terrible rate. And just earlier this year, I had a guy from the BBC on to me. He said, what questions would you put to Professor Jones at the University of East Anglia, right at the heart of this ClimateGate thing? He's the guy that was producing the sort of trumped-up temperature records for the world. And he was right at the heart of this conspiracy, and he was then saying, let's all destroy our data so nobody can check it. He was saying this in emails to some of his scientific colleagues, this extraordinary man. But he was then interviewed, because it all came out in public as a result of ClimateGate. And so the BBC put to him a question that I had given to him. I simply said, has there been any statistically significant warming since 1995? And his answer was, no, not really. He said there has been just a little, but it's barely significant at best. And so here we are, now getting the truth, because I told the BBC what the right question was to ask. So all this stuff about how the world is heating up at an unprecedented rate, all of that we now know not to be true. And in fact, at each stage, the climate left, the climate Marxists, the climate extremists, call them what you will, are being forced back from their original positions. First of all, they were saying we could measure the increase of temperature at the surface. Then that didn't happen. Then they said, well, but it'll all be happening in the upper air, about 6 miles up above the tropics. It should warm 3 times as fast up there as it does down here. Then we checked 50 years of temperature records for the upper troposphere in the tropics and found there had been no such tripling of the surface warming rate. That meant it wasn't man-made warming that was happening. Then they said, well, the warming must be going somewhere, because actually, they had to admit that there hasn't really been much in the way of warming over the last 15 years since this topic became exciting in the public print. And so now they're saying, well, the warming must be hiding in the deep oceans, waiting to come out and catch us all by surprise. The fact is, the arguments they're now trying to produce to make it look as though we still have a problem are wearing very thin, even on their own ears. Now, you mentioned the Himalayas recently. It's now been admitted that they lifted the story about all the Himalayan ice disappearing in the next 25 years from a report by a Marxist journalist quoting an environmental activist friend of his. It wasn't a scientific report, it wasn't peer-reviewed, it wasn't published in any journal. That is the kind of material which the IPCC, the UN's climate panel that we entrust with getting this stuff right, is using, and then saying that this is the sort of material we have to pay attention to.
Yes, Lord Monckton.
And for months, just to finish this, for months, Pachauri was saying there's nothing wrong with this. Indeed, the Himalayan ice really will be gone. Anybody who says it isn't, he said, is a climate denier and is putting the planet at risk. And now he's had to eat crow and admit that he got it wrong. Why didn't he do that a whole lot sooner?
And there's been dozens of these, but I mean, specifically, I get these emails, I watch television, I see the globalist relishing when they talk about we have peer-reviewed journals, you don't, when it's a lie. We have almost all the real peer-reviewed journals. They just make up fantastical frauds, and they relish going over these. But in the time we have left, I specifically want to get into what's coming up at this conference that you're going to be reporting for us on graciously from Cancun, Mexico, and how we, the American people and others listening all over the world, how we ensure that this scheming group of people seeking to seize control of the global economy, how do we ensure that they are defeated?
Right. The first thing that your listeners should do, and you should do it immediately, I mean in the next 24 hours, is to get in touch with your congressmen and your senators and say to them that Fred Upton, who is a rhino, a Republican in name only, should not be appointed the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee now the Republicans have taken control of it, because Fred Upton is a true believer in the whole global warming rubbish. He votes with the Democrats on this as on practically everything else. If he takes control of that committee, vast amounts of damage can be done, and indeed the world might yet find itself going under a climate tyranny, a world government. And that one appointment is, in my view, that what could make the difference between keeping the freedom, prosperity and democracy of the West and losing it. The candidates against Fred Upton are Joe Barton, the current ranking member of the committee on the Republican side. He's a very wonderful man from Texas. I know him well, love him dearly. He's a terrific piece of work, really magical man. And he, by rights, should get this. There's another one called Representative Shimkus, who's also a candidate. He would be very good. I think Joe Barton would probably be better, but Shimkus would be very nearly as good. Either of those would be perfectly acceptable as chairman of that committee. But Fred Upton, who is not reflecting the opinion of the Republican Party on this or many other issues, he would be a disaster, and he might work with the Democrats to see to it that somehow we got Congress to start legislating in this area where at the moment it has failed to do so. So get on to your senators and your congressmen and tell them it mustn't be upped. It mustn't be upped.
Also, the alternative media that's now beginning to displace the corporate prostitute media, we need to really report on what's coming up in the next 2 weeks.
That's absolutely right, because the next thing is there is already a treaty in draft. It no longer contains quite such explicit and open admissions that they're trying to set up a world government as previous treaty drafts did. Nevertheless, it's now going to follow the approach that the EU took, the European Union. They did a little treaty here, a little treaty there, each one not adding too much to the one that previously happened. But by the time you've done 40 years of this, all our freedoms in Britain have gone.